absolutely fantastic weekend. I'm Wallace Chapman. See you next week.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei, a manhunt's underway in Auckland after police release a photo of a suspect in a brutal fatal stabbing. We'll have the latest. Gloriavale says sorry for failing to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation of workers and is calling for victims to come forward. A rāhui's been placed over the far north town of Kaikohe in a bid to stop a violent gang feud. We're there as the town marches for peace. Outdated surrogacy laws could be in for a major rewrite after a report recommends more than 60 changes. And stand by for a booster to the COVID booster. The cull of the white ferns continues, and on the lighter side of life, we meet an old dog, a really old dog, actually the oldest dog in the world.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora tātou, I'm Evie Ashton. The public are being warned against walking alone in the Auckland suburb of Sandringham after a man was fatally stabbed. A man's body was found near the Roy Clements Treeway in Mount Albert on Tuesday, sparking a homicide investigation. Detective Inspector Chris Barry says the police have identified a suspect, 22-year-old Christian Etiuati, who is known to frequent Sandringham. He's described as extremely dangerous.
We would advise people, if they are walking in the area, particularly at night, to use well-lit areas, walk with a friend or another person, and just to be aware of their environment.
Chris Barry says they don't believe the suspect knew the victim. Gloriavale's leaders have offered a public apology for failing to protect victims of labour exploitation and sexual abuse. The apology comes in the wake of multiple scandals surrounding the reclusive West Coast Christian sect. Just this week, Silverfern Farms pulled out of commercial agreements with the community, and the head of its school, Faithful Pilgrim, was suspended from teaching for 3 months after endorsing a teacher he knew had sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl. In the letter, the leaders say much has changed at Gloriavale since its leadership changed in 2018 after founder Neville Cooper died. Cooper himself spent time in prison for sexual offending. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi is now in Kiribati as he continues his whirlwind tour around the Pacific. The visit, aimed at strengthening ties with much of the region, has raised concerns in New Zealand, Australia and the United States. RNZ Pacific's Don Wiseman has the latest developments.
Mr Wang flew into Kiribati for a series of meetings, including with President Tanis Mamau. He's only expected to be in the country until this evening. Earlier, the Chinese Foreign Minister had spent 24 hours in Solomon Islands and is understood to have signed a number of agreements, including on security. But the Solomons public has not been told what is in the deals, and the lack of transparency is also apparent in Kiribati. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister of the Cooks has announced his country will also meet with Mr Wang, along with Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Samoa and Vanuatu.
A vaccinologist believes an extra COVID-19 dose for the most vulnerable people will save lives. A second vaccine booster dose will be available from July for the older population, the severely immunocompromised aged over 16 and aged care residents. They can receive another booster if it's been at least 3 months since a COVID infection or 6 months since their first booster. Vaccinologist Helen Pertussis-Harris says it will help those at risk of serious illness. The Transport Minister has contacted the Transport Agency a second time to reiterate he's uncomfortable with how much it has spent on road safety campaign props. Earlier this year, Waka Kotahi commissioned large illuminated red zeros to promote its Road to Zero campaign at a cost of about $5,000 each. Political reporter Katie Scotcher reports.
Michael Woods says he contacted the transport agency to express his unhappiness with the amount spent when he thought 2 props had been produced. Mr Woods says after making further inquiries, his office has discovered the transport agency purchased 5 red Zeros, costing almost $30,000. He says he's contacted the agency's chair again to stress too much was spent. The money for the large props came from the $4.7 million fund set aside for the Road to Zero campaign.
And the police are speaking with the residents of a street in South Auckland after the death of a baby. Detective Inspector Warwick Adkin says the critically injured child was taken to the Watford Medical Centre in Otara on Monday. A homicide investigation has been launched and people living in Shifnal Drive in Randwick Park are being spoken to. To sport, and New Zealand cricket accepts there may be some short-term pain for the White Ferns following a cull of senior players. Fast bowler Leah Tahuhu and spin bowler Frankie Mackay have joined former captain Amy Satterthwaite in not being offered national contracts following the side's disappointing World Cup performance. 6 new players have been contracted and high-performance manager Brian Stronach accepts the side could initially go backwards.
There can be some short-term pain, but we just don't know what this talent can do right now, and we think that it's really exciting. So who knows what could happen in the short term. We want to be optimistic around that, but we also want to take a really long-term and sustainable approach.
The Crusaders coach, Scott Robertson, is backing Super Rugby's finals format, despite criticism that having 8 of 12 teams qualify devalues the competition. Either the Force or the Highlanders will grab the 8th and final playoff berth this weekend, despite having won only 3 and 4 games, respectively.
I've sort of just embraced it, and that's the way it is, and that's the format. Let's give it a go, and then let's judge it at the back end of it. And this weekend there's a lot of teams, there's a lot of Australians and Kiwis looking where they're going to finish up, so I think that adds to the excitement.
The Crusaders are guaranteed a home quarter-final and will seal second place with a win over the Reds in Christchurch tonight. Meanwhile, Tonga have named former All Blacks Charles Piatou, Malakai Fekitoa and Augustine Pulu, along with former Wallabies star Israel Folau, in their squad for the upcoming Pacific Nations and World Cup qualifier. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, who was the woman known as Jane Roe, who made legal history in Roe versus Wade? I'll talk to the investigative journalist who wrote We Own This City about brazenly corrupt Baltimore police officers. And music writer Nick Duerden on what pop stars do when their light has dimmed. Corkin Hillaho, join me tomorrow morning from 8 here on RNZ National.
You're with Lisa Owen on Checkpoint next. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Friday. For Northland, Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula, fine spells and isolated showers, some heavy in Auckland today. Showers more extensive and heavier in Northland tomorrow. For Waikato, Waitomo, Taumarunui, Taupo and Bay of Plenty, mainly fine, but there are isolated afternoon showers today. From Taranaki to Kapiti, including Taihape, cloudy periods. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa and Wellington, often cloudy, a few showers, clearing from Wellington and Wairarapa tomorrow afternoon. For Marlborough, Nelson and Bulla, mostly cloudy, scattered showers mainly about Bulla and the Sounds, clearing this evening, fine tomorrow. Westland and Fiordland, fine today, cloud increasing tomorrow and a few showers developing towards the evening. Canterbury, Otago and Southland, mainly fine with morning frosts, but a few showers about Banks Peninsula. And for Rekohu, the Chatham Islands, showers easing this evening. The time is 7 minutes past 5. I'll update you with news headlines at 5:30.
Nā mihi iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint I tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. A man is on the run in Auckland tonight after police describe a brutal stabbing of a man in Mount Albert. They have named the suspect they're looking for. He is 22-year-old Christian Etuaiti. He's wanted in relation to the death of a man on Tuesday night. Now, our reporter Louise Tanuth joins us live in the studio with the latest. Louise, what have the police said about this?
Well, police say that a man was killed on Tuesday night in the Mount Albert area, and they have actually released today the suspect, which is 22-year-old Christian Uati, and the man's body was found on Tuesday night on a walkway in a residential area. Now, we were there today. It's your typical suburban area, a walkway near 2 schools in that area as well. There were people out walking their dogs, people out with children and parents just walking the streets as usual. And I should mention students walking to and from school at that time. Now, the man's body was found on Tuesday night and it's been described as a brutal attack. He was killed by a knife with several stab wounds, and Detective Inspector Chris Barry made this plea today.
We do consider Mr Itiwati to be a danger. The public is being advised not to approach him. If you do see Itiwati, please phone 111 immediately.
And what details have the police given about the man who died?
So it's been stated that the man died at about 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday night. His body was found on that walkway. Now, they haven't been able to give much indication or any information about the man. He's not been able to be named by police, and they say they won't be releasing that just yet, nor have they released his age. It's stated that the suspect and the victim were not known to each other, so police have ruled that out. They have received info overnight, so last night, from the public about the suspect. That's how it came to their attention, and he is known in the Sandringham and West Auckland area. Now, anyone helping to hide him could be prosecuted by police, but they're also encouraging anyone that has any kind of information to come forward.
And what are they saying to people who live in that area? As you say, very suburban, schools and community centre as well there.
Yes, as we've established, it's an extremely residential area, 2 key schools in that area. Now, Mount Albert Grammar has issued a statement to students and parents. They're urging all students not to walk alone, to walk in groups, not to wear earpods, and to be extremely aware of their surroundings. And that was also again reiterated by Detective Inspector Chris Barry again today to the general public.
We would advise people, if they are walking in the area, particularly at night, to use well-lit areas, walk with a friend or another person, and just to be aware of their environment.
Thanks, Louise. So that's Louise Tanuth with the latest on that fatal stabbing, and we will put a link to the picture of the suspect on our webpage. It is 10 minutes past 5. Kia mau tonu mai, you are listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. A call for peace in a town grappling with gang violence, a hikoi through Kaikohe today, culminated in a rāhui being placed over the far north town in the hope it might quiet a bitter feud between rivals. The town has seen multiple shootings and a daylight brawl on its main street in recent months. Police believe events in Kaikohe are linked to a feud in Auckland between the tribesmen and their former feeder gang, the Killer Bees. Meanwhile, locals say police presence is all good and well, but it'll take far more to bring peace. Nick Trubridge and Marika Habazi have this story from Kaikohe.
My kids came home from school yesterday and said that they were doing drills. I thought they were talking about fire drills. No. They were practicing what to do if a shooter turns up at the kura.
You're listening to the voice of Quinton Hita of Ngāti Uionione. Your ears aren't deceiving you. This is what it's come to in Kaikohe. Kids in kura training for an active shooter.
What sort of world is that? Is that the world we want to leave our tamariki?
Violence, drive-by shootings, brawls in broad daylight. This community in the Far North District finds itself at the centre of gang warfare. It's also a community saying enough's enough. 5 hapu, 1 united voice. A rāhui placed over their town in the hope it might bring calm. The hikoi rolls down the main street, their banner lit up as the sun rises over Broadway. He rāhui ki kone, uplift the mana of hapu and Kaikohe.
This group, te tiahotanga, ngā hapu o tēnei, takiwa, are standing up in their authority for our whānau. This rāhui we've invoked today is about protection of all people and the prohibition of gang violence in our rohe.
Mane Tahiri's voice echoes as a crowd of hundreds congregates. But there are some notable absentees. We were told representatives of both the Killer Bees and tribesmen would be here today. There's not a patch in sight. Mr Tahiri says conversations are ongoing.
There has been kōrero in the past, most recently in the past couple of weeks and days. There's ongoing kōrero. There was another tikanga that we were going to place today, but that never eventuated.
The solutions, well, they're a work in progress too. Cops, a crackdown, well, they're quick fixes the community say might slow gang activity, but won't stop it.
There's an element of holisticness that hapu and Māori have that hasn't been fully investigated, hasn't been fully equipped and resourced. It's things like health determinants, poverty, housing, everything. So these struggles lead to one thing, lead to the next thing, lead to the next.
So with the rāhui placed, the crowds disperse. But the job is not over, they're told. That's the sense you get here. There's plenty to do. Decades of neglect, deprivation, lack of opportunity for youth, blamed for the battle playing out on main roads and back streets.
We're a town which is a very young town in population. You're talking the medium age is 28 and a half. So 50% of those people are below that age. And you look at gang affiliation, well, where does that fit? It's in that age bracket.
This is Kaikohe Business Association Chairwoman Linda Bracken. She lives in Kaikohe, right next door to the house shot up on Tuesday.
There are children in there.
There are children in the house. It's a family house. It's not one, in recent times, it's more a new community of people that have moved in who are working with other people in town to address some of the youth and the youth responses.
But her fear isn't for her own safety.
My greatest fear is that there'll be a short-term response rather than a long-term solution.
Northland Regional Council Deputy Chair Justin Blakey cuts us off in his ute. He knows why we're here and doesn't need an invite to talk about how to tackle the turf war in his hometown.
I think the issues revolve around, the decades that this community's been trying to live within, the high deprivation indices, and this is, the government has successive governments have known this for decades. So I believe we need targeted investment in terms of economic development to lift this community out of the poverty that it's experienced for decades.
He tells us Kaikohe was a town of high educational achievement, but many top teachers, people to guide the town's youth, left as social issues came up.
We have to ask ourselves, what's the difference between a child that grows up to end up in a gang and one that grows up to be successful? And I'll tell you the answer. Families that have got the support structures and the well-being, to provide the guidance and support for their tamariki, they don't end up in gangs. But the ones that are ending up in gangs, the whānau structure, it's been depleted. And I think the cause of that is the long-standing social issues that are associated with deprivation.
Meanwhile, the backdrop to that discussion appears to be deteriorating. Drive-by shootings, a brawl in the main street, and a gangland grudge between killerbees and tribesmen linked to unrest further south. Some say, frankly, they're somewhat scared of the only place they've ever known and what it could become.
At the end of the day, the way things are going, our babies are going to get hurt. And that's, no mother or father or grandmother or grandfather ever wants to bury their children or grandchildren, eh?
For now, a call for peace in a town desperate for it.
And if you were listening to that on radio, you can see Marika and Nick's video version of the story on our webpage. Another jab's on the agenda for those most at risk of serious illness from COVID. The additional booster shot has been recommended by the Ministry of Health Vaccine Advisory Group and is intended for the elderly, aged and disability care residents and severely immunocompromised people over the age of 16. So potentially several 100,000 people, but the final list is yet to be decided. And the booster will be given 6 months after the last one. Ko taku manuhiri anai nei, ko Chris Hipkins, the COVID response minister, joins us now. Tēnā koe e te minita, how have you been?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been a while.
It has. So, why isn't everyone getting an offer of another booster?
The advice we've had from our health, from the technical advisory group who look at all of the evidence from around the world is that we should be focusing additional booster doses at this point on the most at risk. So our older population, those with additional underlying health needs and so on, they're not recommending a rollout of an additional booster to everybody else. Now, other people can still get that if they've got a good reason and they feel they've got a good reason to get it. They can go to their GPs. GPs can prescribe off-label additional vaccination. So if people have feel that they have an exceptional case, they can make that case to their medical professional, who will be able to give them the right advice.
Any examples of what an exceptional case would be to get it?
Look, it may be that if people really it's a matter for people to talk to their GP about. People who are travelling internationally, for example, if they're travelling to a place where there's particularly acute infection of COVID-19, they may want to get an additional booster. They could go to their GP and talk that through with them. We're following ultimately what the medical advice is, which is at this point based on the science, based on what the evidence internationally is. We're best to target our efforts at this point on the more at-risk segment of the population.
There is obviously a very high overrepresentation of elderly people in the daily death statistics. Is there any evidence that earlier vaccinations are waning for that group?
Not necessarily. If you look at the statistics, they do show that one of the things we've been tracking, of course, is the overall mortality rate for older populations and how much higher that is at the moment compared to what we would normally expect to see, particularly what we'd normally expect to see heading into winter. And the group where we are seeing a difference is for that 90-plus age group. COVID-19 clearly is having an impact there. What we don't know, of course, is whether that is simply whether, and it's a horrible thing to talk about in this way, but whether those are people who might otherwise have passed away later in the winter. And so, we'll, I guess, be able to see that right once we see the full picture of the year.
So why are you not offering it until July?
At the moment, we've there's two things at play here. One is the advice is that it should be 6 months after the first booster shot. So for most people, they wouldn't hit that 6 month period until about mid to late June. And the other is that we have to make a minor amendment to the Medicines Act to allow for repeat use of a previously approved vaccine. So MedSafe's approval process relies on Pfizer applying for an approval, which they've done, but then the original approval, of course, specified for a first, second and a third dose, but not for a fourth dose. And so in order to allow for repeat usage of the same pre-approved vaccine, we need to make sure that the law allows for that.
And does that law also need to allow for the fact that people can get it outside of their GP?
No, people can get that at the moment. So people can go to their GPs I think I might have answered the wrong question here, but people can go to their GP at the moment and they can get an additional dose on prescription. They can do that right now. In order to make it more broadly available without prescription, though, that is why we will need that additional legislative amendment.
So that you can keep vaccinating people at big events and at places other than a GP's office, in essence.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at where the majority of our boosters were administered for the first booster round, that actually pharmacies have been one of the real backbone of doing a lot of that vaccination work.
When will you decide if the general population needs an annual top-up? Because you offered the initial booster, I think, in around January, so people will be wondering when they get their next jab. Is it going to be like the flu vaccination, and when will you tell us?
We haven't had good advice on that. Of course, very few countries around the world have found themselves in that position yet. But I think, I guess to some extent, those of us in the southern hemisphere have the advantage of being 6 months behind the northern hemisphere in terms of, seasonal fluctuations and so on. So we can learn from what we see from the northern hemisphere.
So then what would be the timeline to make a decision by summer of next year?
Oh, we get advice from the Vaccine Advisory Group. They're reviewing the evidence all of the time as it comes in.
Are they reviewing that specific issue, Minister, right now?
Of course, and they're reviewing everything. They're always reviewing whether the ongoing vaccination evidence, and as soon as they give us advice, we're in a position that we can act on that.
And is Pfizer going to be the booster shot again?
Yes, it is for this one. We've got enough doses in stock to meet the needs of that at-risk population that we've talked about. So we'll be able to roll that out to them just as soon as all of the approval processes are in place. And we have an ability to get more in the event that we need to. But we've also got other vaccines, that have been approved as a primary course of vaccine. And as evidence emerges about their usefulness or effectiveness as boosters, again, we will keep that under constant review so that if other boosters come in that look like that they're promising and that they're, useful, then we'll approve those when and if the science backs that up.
Good to talk to you, Minister. Thanks for joining us. That is Chris Hipkins, the COVID Response Minister. Te kuna mai o whakaaro, we would love your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mō te hōtaka nei. What do you make about the booster situation? So they're going to give it to people who are immunocompromised or, elderly or in disability care facilities. Does that go far enough? And do you think we need to have annual COVID vaccinations? Text me, Pātui Mai 2101. Tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. The leadership of Gloriavale is publicly repenting, issuing a statement apologising for failing to protect sex abuse victims and exploited workers. A landmark court decision recently ruled that 3 former residents of the commune were employees from age 6, doing strenuous, difficult and sometimes dangerous work, all unpaid. And several members of the reclusive West Coast Christian community have been convicted of sexually abusing children. Today's statement, attributed to Gloriavale's current leadership, also calls for any leavers who are harmed in the commune to come forward. And joining us now is Daniel Pilgrim, who took an employment court case against Gloriavale and won. Kia ora, Daniel. What do you make of the apology today?
Hey, g'day. It's a great start, and I think there definitely seems to be some, a desire now to start changing things. But yeah, I think I would personally say that the leaders themselves are not capable of making enough of the changes themselves, and so it needs to be taken out of their hands, really.
So do you think it's genuine?
Yes, a lot of it is. I don't agree with all of their statements, obviously, about everything historic and present, that have gone on, and also they make out some of their changes. A lot of the things they made out in that apology were, they were saying these are changes that we've made in the last few years. Some of them have been made since the court ruling.
Yeah, so basically in their statement they apologise, but, infer that they've cleaned up their act. None of the things that have been highlighted are still happening. So how would you describe your level of confidence that things have improved and improved greatly?
So what we've seen over the years is the only changes that have ever been made there have come about from external pressures. And so what the way I see this is they're basically putting their hand up saying, we're sorting it out and leave it to us. And I don't think that's going to be wise. Sure, they're genuine, but all of those things have come from all the changes that have been made are from external pressures and on every level. And so, there needs to be transparency, there needs to be government involvement on just what's going on. You can't just leave it with the leaders to make those changes because they're not able to, in my opinion.
So, if not the leaders, you're saying some government intervention, but who should drive the change? Or does this community need to be broken up?
No, I really don't know where to start, to be honest, but I wouldn't say breaking it up at this point is going to be the best course of action, but there definitely needs to be involvement. And one thing that they didn't address at all in their apology, which is sort of more central to this employment case that's just gone through, is there are people currently in there, my best friend who's my age, has the exact same set of facts as me, so he is an employee. He's now worked 6 years full time in there, and he worked today. He's doing long hours, 6.5 days a week, and he's still working every day, and that hasn't been addressed. So I'm really hoping that can be addressed, and they didn't actually mention that at all, which is really what the case was about. Without pay, Daniel, you mean? Yes, yeah, he's still working in there without pay every day.
The statement says that they are going to support people who decide to leave. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think they don't really understand the real world, and so I was just having this conversation at home. They view $1,000 as heaps of money, and so they've, even now, if they think, we're really helping this person out, we're going to send them away with $3,000. That's not going to actually cut it. That doesn't go very far. especially not if they've worked there 20 years, so there needs to be some involvement in that as well.
Have you heard from anyone from within the community, and I mean the leadership, since you won your case to directly apologise to you and to discuss where to from here?
No, not at all.
And what do you think of that?
It doesn't surprise me, to be honest. Last time I was on the phone with one of the leaders, I'd gone over to see my grandma, and he told me I was never welcome back over there. So that's where they left it with me.
And do you think that attitude has changed at all, even though they state that they're prepared to talk to leavers and assist them? Do you have faith in that?
Not really. On an individual level, maybe, but there's definitely a lot of people in power over there that I wouldn't put faith in that regard at all.
I note that they're also inviting leavers who may have been abused or disadvantaged while living in the community to come forward and speak to them directly. I mean, how comfortable would you be doing that, given your experience?
Yeah, I probably just wouldn't go there, but because I don't see that they would be able to help me in any way. But I mean, I think that's great if there are leavers that want to do that. Good for them.
Thank you for speaking to us this evening. That is Daniel Pilgrim, who was one of the three who took that successful employment case against Gloriavale. They were deemed to be workers, unpaid at that. The Prime Minister has secured a meeting with the leader of the free world. Te Piramia will sit down with US President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris at the White House next week. It's only the third time New Zealand's Prime Minister has met with the President in 2 decades. The meeting comes at a critical time with the war in Ukraine and increasing competition in the Pacific. Here's our political reporter, Katie Scotcher.
The critical chief-to-chief meeting at the White House locked in.
I'll be meeting with the President of the United States on Tuesday. I'll also be meeting with the Vice President of the United States on that same day.
Jacinda Ardern travelled to the United States without a sit-down confirmed. It's thought her recent COVID infection had complicated arrangements. The event, which will take place in the early hours of Wednesday, will be the first White House visit for a New Zealand Prime Minister since John Key met Barack Obama in 2014.
Well, it is a great pleasure to welcome my good friend, Prime Minister Key, to the Oval Office.
It'll also be the first time Ms Ardern and Joe Biden meet face-to-face, and there's lots to discuss.
I imagine on the agenda will be the likes of the war in Ukraine and the considerable effort New Zealand has put into ensuring that we're playing our part. I imagine we'll equally discuss our region and the fact that it is becoming increasingly contested, and the role of the United States in our regional economy is important.
Gun reform dominated discussions with Republicans and Democrats during Ms Ardern's visit to Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. earlier this week. She says while the conversation with Mr Biden will be free-flowing, gun reform will likely come up.
I will certainly be passing on New Zealand's sorrow for what we have seen. To see children at the heart of this most recent event is devastating, so I will certainly acknowledge that.
Former US Ambassador and National Minister Tim Grosser says the tragedy has elevated Ms Ardern's relevance in the US.
The Christchurch massacre and her positioning of New Zealand over that is, in the most horrible sense, given an opportunity to sound very relevant to Americans, I think.
New Zealand has pushed for the US to rejoin the CPTPP ever since former US President Donald Trump abandoned the trade pact. While it's extremely unlikely the US will rejoin anytime soon, Ms Ardern says she will raise it at next week's meeting. NZ-US Council Executive Director Jordan Small wants Ms Ardern to discuss other ways the two countries can develop their trade relationship.
We can work with what the US is able to do, so that's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and find opportunities within that framework to advance New Zealand's interests and improve conditions for our exporters and businesses.
Victoria University's Director of the Centre of Strategic Studies, David Capey, says most importantly, the meeting is a chance for Ms Ardern and Mr Biden to build a rapport.
Really is a pretty special opportunity to have that personal interaction, try and build a personal relationship and to put forward New Zealand's interests and views on a range of issues.
He says the two leaders are already off to a good start, saying they head into next week's sit-down with shared interests and similar views on a range of topics.
And that's Katie Scotcher reporting. Kia ora, e te iwi e haere ake nei I a checkpoint. Would-be parents using surrogates may no longer have to legally adopt their own children. More veteran players are dumped from the White Ferns, and Bromley residents think a council compo package has the stink of stinginess about it. Homai o whakaaro, we'd love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program. You can text me on 2101, tweet us at checkpointrnz, and the email address, well, that's checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time for the headlines now. Ko Evie anō tēnei.
Thanks, Lisa. The public are being warned against walking alone in the Auckland suburb of Sandringham after a man was fatally stabbed. A man's body was found in Mount Albert on Tuesday, sparking a homicide investigation. Police are hunting a suspect, 22-year-old Christian Ituati. He's known to frequent Sandringham and who they describe as extremely dangerous. Gloriavale's leaders have offered a public apology for failing to protect victims of labour exploitation and sexual abuse. The apology comes after multiple scandals surrounding the reclusive West Coast Christian sect. Its leaders say much has changed at Gloriavale since its leadership changed in 2018 after founder Neville Cooper died. The elderly, aged and disability care residents and severely immunocompromised people over the age of 16 will be eligible for a second COVID vaccine booster from July. The Minister for COVID-19 Response, Chris Hipkins, told Checkpoint that international scientific evidence suggests that it's most effective to focus providing additional boosters to those most at risk of serious illness from COVID. Police in Texas are facing mounting anger over the way they dealt with a mass shooting at an elementary school on Tuesday, in which 19 children and 2 teachers died. Questions are being asked about why it took an hour for them to engage gunman Salvador Ramos after he barricaded himself inside a classroom. Footage on social media shows distraught parents outside the school being kept back behind a police line as the tragedy unfolded inside. And Christchurch residents living near a foul-smelling, broken-down wastewater plant say they're insulted by the council's financial support offer. As part of a $1 million fund voted on by the council yesterday, $200 is available to each household in the area around Bromley to spend at their discretion. But residents say that won't go far. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 6.
Thanks, Evie. No mai, hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. It's time for the business news now. Ko taku hoa e nainei, ko Nona Peltier. Nona, DGL. People may remember this company. Anyway, it's going to delist from the NZX following derogatory comments by its chief executive. What reason is it giving for this? Fill in the gaps.
Well, let's see. First of all, the reason it's given is that it listed on the NZX ASX last year, May 24th. And since then, they're saying that even though they have like 689 shareholders, they basically account for only 2.4% of all of its shares, and that basically it's not worth being listed on the NZX as far as they're concerned. That's the reason they're giving. And they haven't mentioned another recent controversy involving the company where the chief executive, people might remember Simon Henry, basically suggested that the chef and the founder of My Food Bag had used her sexuality and her race to sell shares and to prop up the company. That did not go down very well, as you might recall. I think you had an opportunity to speak to the chair at that time.
I don't think it did, but yeah, it caused a lot of controversy, obviously, and it shaved off some of their worth, did it not?
It certainly did. And today, even though they're going to be delisted from the end of June and then begin all the shareholders who were NZX shareholders will be shifted off to the ASX. So they'll still be able, nothing's going to really happen other than it will no longer be trading on the NZX from June 28th, delisted June 30th, and then onto the ASX from that point forward. And for some people, it will be really good riddance, I think. There's been a lot of controversy about it.
The interesting thing was, at the time, did do an interview with one of the big retirement investment funds that said they would not go near DGL until there was a change in governance, and because it did not meet their requirements for basically ethical behaviour at that point after the comments were made. So that is an interesting development. All right, let's move on to consumer sentiment. It's slipped to recessionary levels, Nona.
This is...
Okay, who says?
Well, this is an ANZ Roy Morgan consumer confidence survey. It's the one we typically use. The industry as gauges. There are a lot of information is based on this particular sentiment survey. The confidence has been slipping. It's now really at a level we haven't seen really since the 2008 global financial crisis, and as well, the number of people who think that they should be buying a major appliance or some big purchase at the moment is sunk below that level that we saw back in 2008. So the numbers are pretty dire. And inflationary pressures, though, interesting. The outlook consumers are saying now is that they think that inflation won't be quite as bad. So perhaps what the Reserve Bank governor is doing to drop inflation expectations, to rein in consumer spending, maybe having some effect. But look, it's important that this is the first time, this is one of the report makes this point, that this is one of the few times that we've seen consumers feeling like there's, that it's a real...
They're battling down the hatches.
Well, yes. And if this translates into retail spending, it's bad news for retailers too. It means that consumers are closing their wallet and they're going to hang on tight for the foreseeable future. So that optimism that we often see consumers say, well, it's not good now, but better days ahead, we're not seeing it in this survey.
Okay. Is there more optimistic things that you can tell us about from the markets?
Yeah, well...
Okay.
Can you?
Give it to us.
Let's see. Well, let me see. The U.S. Federal Reserve is kind of seem to be buttoning back on their aggressive stand on their official cash rate. So interest rates in the United States may not escalate as fast as we were expecting. That's had a positive effect on the dollar. Not so much if you're an exporter, but if you're going on a holiday, yes. So 65.2 U.S. cents. Mm-hmm. That was a bit of a perk up because the U.S. dollar index fell. Steady at 91.3 Australian and 51.5 pence. So not a lot of change there. The local top 50 index, it dropped 0.33%, 38-point drop to 11,065. Now that's a new low for this year. I can't say this has been a really great day, but for some people, they'll say, yeah, I'm going to save a few pennies when I head off to California.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business News there. The laws governing surrogacy in New Zealand are outdated and in need of a major overhaul, according to a review by the Law Commission. Top of the list, changing the legal status of intended parents who use a surrogate, meaning they will no longer have to adopt their own child after it's born. At the moment, the person carrying the baby is the legal parent, regardless of whose genetic material is used. The review also calls for clarification of what costs a surrogate can be reimbursed for, but does not recommend full commercial surrogacy. Now, joining us now to discuss the findings is the Law Commission's Kaikohe Taumata, or Principal Advisor, Nicola Lambie. Kia ora, Nicola.
Kia ora, Lisa.
So tell me, first of all, the intended parents, because this will be an issue that a lot of people are acutely interested in. Currently, They really have no legal rights to the child their surrogate is carrying. They adopt the child after it is born. But what should happen?
Yeah, that's right. So at the moment, the surrogate and her partner are the child's legal parents, and the law simply doesn't provide a process other than adoption for the intended parents to be recognised as that child's parents. So what we're recommending is a specific legal framework to accommodate surrogacy in New Zealand law. And we don't think that a family court process is necessary to establish legal parenthood with the regulatory safeguards we already have in place for surrogacy in New Zealand.
So in practical terms, how would it work? What would they need to become the legal parents?
Yeah, so at the moment, most surrogacy arrangements in New Zealand are approved in advance by the Ethics Committee on Assisted Reproductive Technology, that's called ECART. And then once they have that approval, they go through their fertility treatment, but then they also have to go through an adoption process where they have to be assessed as fit and proper people to adopt by an Ōranga Tamariki social worker, and then once a child is born, they go to the family court for their adoption order. What we recommend is once they have that ECART approval in advance, then that should be a simple administrative process that can take place shortly after birth, where the surrogate confirms to consent and the intended parents become the legal parents and can register the child's birth as normal.
Does that change anyone's rights during the pregnancy? For example, could the intended parents then say to the surrogate, I don't want you to drink, I don't want you to smoke? Whose interests take priority?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we're recommending is that the surrogate remains the legal parent at birth. And that's really just to safeguard her rights and interests throughout the pregnancy and birth. But we also recognise that intended parents need rights here too, because quite often it will be their genetic child that the surrogate is carrying. So what we're recommending is in that interim period, once the child is born and until the surrogate gives her consent, the intended parent should be deemed to be legal guardians of that child automatically under the law. And that just reflects the shared intention and plans of the parties.
I was interested in your report that it's not compulsory required to have any kind of written agreement before going down the path of surrogacy.
Yeah, that's right. So there isn't any requirement for a written agreement. However, those arrangements that do go through the ECART process, they do require the parties to obtain independent legal advice. They go through counselling individually and together, and those counselling reports that the counsellors then provide to ECART record the details of what the parties discussed. But we are recommending that actually we think that the parties should have a surrogacy plan that can be a really simple, straightforward document. But we need to bear in mind that pregnancy is a long time, and sometimes it can take a long time for a person to become pregnant. So it might be years that the surrogacy arrangement is in place, and having a simple document that the parties can refer back to should help to resolve any issues that arise.
You mentioned the Ethics Committee a few times, right? So that's where you go to get approval for gestational surrogacy. So where the person carrying the child has no genetic link to that child, right? But you are wanting to expand the arrangements that have to go through some form of regulation. Why do you want to do that? Because one of the main complaints is that this Ethics Committee takes so long to make decisions.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So there are a couple of points there. In relation to traditional surrogacy arrangements, so these are arrangements where the surrogate is the genetic parent of the child. These can happen privately. They don't have to go through a clinic, but increasingly people are going to a clinic, and what the clinics are doing is sending it to ECART for ethical advice, because ECART can't actually approve those arrangements. So what we think is that people who choose a traditional surrogacy arrangement should be able to go to ECART if they want to. And if they don't want to, then we're recommending a specific court process that is tailored to surrogacy that they can go down instead.
Okay, just very quickly, money for surrogacy arrangements. You do not support a move to commercial surrogacy. Why is that?
Yeah, for a lot of reasons, but primarily it's a fundamentally different way to practice surrogacy, and it's not something that was widely supported in consultation. But what we do recognise is the current law is not working because surrogates are being left out of pocket because the law is unclear. So what we do recommend, in line with comparable jurisdictions, is that we should be making the law really clear that intended parents can pay for a surrogate's costs, including compensation for lost income if she has to take time out of work because of the pregnancy or birth.
Thank you for your time this evening. That is the Law Commission's Principal Advisor, Nicola Lambie. New Zealand, Australia and the US are all eyes on the Pacific as China's Foreign Minister tours several islands. Wang Yi has just landed in Kiribati to talk bilateral relations with the country's president. RNZ's Moira Tuilaipa Taylor reports.
This is Mr Wang's second stopover to a Pacific Island country after a 2-day visit to Solomon Islands, where he formalised a number of development cooperation frameworks, arrangements to strengthen China's relations with Honiara. His visit to the Pacific region has been closely watched by New Zealand, the US and Australia. A local journalist in Kiribati, Rimon, says the secretive nature of Mr Wang's visit had angered some locals. Mr Rimon says the Chinese foreign minister landed on Tarawa just after 1 p.m. local time and was received by Cabinet Minister Makarite Temari. He says the visit by the high-level delegation is significant because of a potential security deal, similar to the one between China and Solomon Islands, is likely to be on the agenda.
All information we try to get from the government, they have been really secretive about it. So at this stage, we do not know that the government has not disclosed what those agreements are.
Fiji is to host a meeting next week where 2 leaked Chinese government documents are expected to be tabled. In a letter to a number of Pacific leaders, the President of the Federated States of Micronesia said he had serious concerns about the documents. A concern echoed by the director of the Macmillan Brown Centre for Pacific Studies at the University of Canterbury, Stephen Ratuva.
It's going to be very transformational, very different from the current status quo, which is very much bilaterally based, where China has individual relationship with particular countries. In this particular case, it's the entire region, it's the whole bloc which they're trying to create.
He says the geopolitical gaming has already started, with Australia's new Foreign Minister Penny Wong heading to the Pacific in the first week of her new role to push back. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says decisions on links with China are ultimately for independent Pacific nations. However, she says the region needs a coordinated response to recent developments, and the upcoming forum meeting is the place for this.
That will be the chance to revisit the Bikitawa Declaration and ask ourselves, have we fulfilled the objectives we set ourselves, which was first and foremost to look to one another as a Pacific family to respond to the security issues that we may have.
There is still no confirmed date for the meeting. Mr Wang is also expected to visit Fiji on Sunday and Monday and Papua New Guinea next Thursday and Friday. He also has plans to travel to other Pacific Island nations, including Vanuatu, Samoa and Tonga. The Cook Islands Prime Minister Mark Brown has confirmed to local media that scheduled talks with Wang Yi will be held this week.
Locals living in the stench in Christchurch's Bromley feel a bit ripped off by the council's financial aid. Christchurch City Council is promising to spend $1 million to give some relief to the thousands of residents living there. It works out to be $200 per household. Tessa Guest has been gauging reaction.
Katinka Visser is at her wit's end. Since the fire at the wastewater plant last year, she's been trapped breathing the nausea-inducing air. Her disability prevents her from driving.
You know, I do have to try and look at the good side as well as, you know, it's just that the bad side knocks all the good days out so quickly.
She counts herself lucky to live within the zone of households eligible for grants, but says it barely scratches the surface of costs she's already incurred.
$200 is nothing. Like, it's cost me $300 for an air purifier. And my power bill, I'm just scared stiff about what it's going to look like.
Paul Dury isn't in the zone of residents receiving a cash boost, even though he lives just 2 kilometres from the plant, but he says it wouldn't have made a difference anyway. He thinks recovery costs will reach hundreds of millions and says if the council doesn't open its coffers now, they'll pay the price later.
The cost of the peeling paint, of the damage to vehicles, of the property damage, and long-term damage to health, which no one has any idea of what that's going to be.
Bromley resident Vicky Walker is also fed up. She's been lobbying the council to provide proactive support for months, but it's taken a toll.
I've spent so much time away from my job, and I'm self-employed. You know, it's a lot of work. Who's going to pay me for my loss in income?
Her husband has a lung disease and works in the area. She says the 6 months since the fire have been stressful.
It wakes us up in the night and then we can't get back to sleep. It brings on anxiety for me because I need my sleep. My husband needs to sleep. He's got a lung disease. So we live, work in the area.
Mrs. Walker says the council could have provided a quick fix, a bulk order of air purifiers, which cost around $300 each. City Councillor Jani Johansson agrees.
If an air purifier is one of the things that can make a big difference, then I think the call that people have made, which I endorse, is that council should be looking at bulk purchasing air purifiers and providing them.
Mr. Johansson has been pushing for quicker action and wellbeing support since last year and says the package is just a starting point.
Our council staff have said that this is almost unprecedented in the world around the scale of damage to a wastewater treatment plant. So for me, what's been really important is that council acknowledges that we're effectively in a disaster crisis management role.
Alongside financial support, Council agreed yesterday to provide a detailed recovery plan and to investigate establishing a health register for affected residents.
Advocates say refugees due to arrive in New Zealand from Australia and detention centres in Nauru will need to be treated with care and dignity. In March, Australia agreed to allow 150 refugees to resettle in Aotearoa each year over the next 3 years. The first could arrive in the next few months. Robin Martin has more.
Australia has used offshore detention centres to process refugees since the early 2000s, a practice that has been widely criticised. A deal to resettle some of these refugees here was negotiated by the John Key government in 2013, but never previously acted on. Kurdish-Iranian writer and political refugee Perus Buchani was detained on Manus Island and now lives in Wellington. He says, first and foremost, the refugees need to be treated with dignity.
They have been traumatized, and that is really important that people and the system treat them with dignity.
Buchani says it's a great thing that New Zealand is doing, but he's upset the deal does not include Manus Island refugees relocated to Port Moresby in 2019. Mustafa Dabashi is the president of the Asylum Seekers Support Trust. He believes this group might need additional mental health support.
Being detained for a long time does create a lot of problems within the people and how they look into life and how they can process even the life after that. So they need really to be looked after in this particular area.
Dabashi says they should be resettled in the main centres.
Some people, they love the bigger cities, and unfortunately we have a huge demand on, the city like Auckland, but if that helps those people in their life, even, when they start their life, so I think we should go for it.
Refugees as Survivors provides mental health and well-being services to the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre. Chief Executive Sharon Ward says they're already planning for the care this cohort of refugees might need.
I believe they've been through quite a lot over there, and I wouldn't like to comment politically on it, but there's definitely been some fallout, including some possible mental health problems, anxiety, self-harm, etc., etc.
Ward says they're well prepared for any issues.
We've got sort of a full multidisciplinary team here, and we'll literally assess the client and give the service that fits, because that's what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Meanwhile, regardless of the challenges they still face, Perus Buchani says the refugees will be overjoyed to arrive in New Zealand.
I think they come here with a great feeling. They are positive about this country. They like this country. That's why they want to come here. And that's why I think definitely they have a good picture, positive picture about New Zealand.
Immigration New Zealand says as part of the program at Mangere, a settlement plan is developed for each refugee family. This includes 12 months community support in areas such as health, mental health, education and employment, and specialist support where required.
The cull has continued in the White Ferns, with 2 more players from the World Cup squad finding themselves left right out. Following Amy Satterthwaite, out of favour is her wife, Leah Tahuhu, Frankie Mackay, Tamsin Newton and Lee Kasparek. Felicity Reid reports.
The White Ferns are still without a coach, just 64 days before their next tournament. The squad has also lost 769 international caps since their last outing, the early World Cup exit. While waiting to announce a new coach, New Zealand Cricket has swept aside players it doesn't see fitting into the T20 format, opting for youth over experience. Leah Tahuhu says the level of change on the contract list is unprecedented.
Over probably men's and women's contracting lists, I don't think there's ever been 6 changes to a contract list, so they've certainly decided to go in a new direction and, I guess, drop the axe quite willingly.
Unlike Satterthwaite, Tahuhu isn't ruling out playing for New Zealand again and says the cutthroat process hasn't dented her relationship with New Zealand cricket.
Not being offered a contract is one thing, but it doesn't mean that you can't be selected, I guess, in the future. So for me, that's something that I guess I'm holding on to. I do hope to play for New Zealand again. I think I've got a lot to offer still, and if a new coach did come in and decide that they wanted me to be a part of that, I would be more than open to being able to pull on that shirt again.
Tahuhu believes today's contract list might look different if the White Ferns' results at the home 50-over World Cup this year had been different.
If we didn't make a semi-final or a final, I guess it would be harder for these decisions to be made, certainly.
But she also believes, personally, she's in the form of her career.
I've been bowling some of the best in my career, but look, that's not always what decisions are based on, I guess. So you have to respect the decision and the view that New Zealand Cricket have taken.
New Zealand Cricket's high-performance manager Brian Stonick says while it's difficult telling players like Tahuhu and Satterthwaite they'd missed out on contracts, the team needs to move in a new direction after their failure at the World Cup. He accepts it is a balancing act when it comes to how many veteran players to let go and how many younger talents to bring through.
You can go too far either way with these things. So I think when we look at it, we've got a nice blend of that experience with the youth coming through, and it's exciting what our system's starting to produce and the talent that's coming through, and we want to give that talent some opportunities to put the results on the board and get this team to where we all want and need it to be.
Stronach accepts initially that could mean going backwards results-wise.
There can be some short-term pain, but we just don't know what this talent can do right now, and we think that it's really exciting. So who knows what could happen in the short term. We want to be optimistic around that, but we also want to take a really long-term and sustainable approach.
The White Ferns' next tournament is T20 at the Commonwealth Games. The 6 newly contracted players are 18-year-olds Fran Jonas, Izzy Gaze and Georgia Plummer, and 20-year-olds Molly Penfold, Nensai Patel and Eden Carson.
Some of your feedback on Gloriavale issuing an apology. There's a similar theme in this feedback. Leslie says it's interesting that the apology has come after some big companies cancel contracts, isn't it? Another person says, after the employment court finds against Gloriavale, only after teachers are suspended do they say sorry. The current leaders aren't that new.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. The police say the man who was fatally stabbed as he walked home in Auckland on Tuesday evening was brutally attacked. A homicide investigation was launched yesterday after a body was found near the Roy Clements Treeway in Mount Albert. Detective Inspector Chris Barry says the police have identified a suspect, 22-year-old Christian Etuati. He's described as extremely dangerous. Mr. Barry says they don't believe the suspect knew the victim.
I can advise that it was multiple injuries sustained by our victim.
Chris Barry says the police are in contact with the victim's family and they're not releasing a name yet. Former members of the Gloriavale community who were harmed at the commune are being urged to come forward. The leaders of the reclusive Christian sect on the West Coast are apologising for failing to protect members against sexual abuse and labour exploitation. It comes after a series of scandals involving the Christian sect, including company Silver Ferns no longer supplying offal to the community because of its labour practices. In another incident, the head of Gloriavale's school was suspended after endorsing a teacher who had sexually assaulted a girl. Today's apology says much has changed at Gloriavale since its leadership changed in 2018 when founder and convicted sex offender Neville Cooper died. Police in Texas are facing mounting anger over the way they dealt with a mass shooting at an elementary school on Tuesday. Questions are being asked about why it took an hour for them to engage Salvador Ramos after he barricaded himself inside a classroom. Footage on social media shows distraught parents outside the school being kept back behind a police line as the tragedy unfolded inside. Kim Hammond lives close to the school.
What I couldn't get my brain to figure out was like, why were there civilian moms? They looked like moms with this panic look and running. They were just like a dead sprint towards the school. And that's when my brain started to say, something's going on at this school.
19 children and 2 teachers were killed in the attack. A Law Commission report says surrogacy law is out of date and needs to be reformed. The report has been presented to Parliament today. The principal advisor to the Commission, Nicola Lambie, says surrogacy has become an established method of family building for people who are unable to carry a child themselves. But she says a key problem is that the law doesn't recognise it as a process that creates a parent-child relationship. She says intended parents must instead rely on 65-year-old adoption law, which isn't in line with modern practices. Ms Lambie says changes are needed to meet the needs and expectations of New Zealanders. Christchurch residents living near a foul-smelling, broken-down wastewater plant are insulted by the council's financial support offer. $200 is available to each household in the area around Bromley to spend at their discretion as part of a $1 million fund voted on by the council yesterday. Katinka Visser counts herself lucky to live within the zone of households eligible for grants, but says it doesn't go far.
$200 is nothing like it's cost me $300 for an air purifier and my power bill. I'm just scared stiff about what it's going to look like.
The council has also agreed to investigate establishing a health register for affected residents. Wellington commercial property owners say the lack of certainty around quake strengthening requirements is a costly nightmare. Around 150 buildings in the CBD share the same floor as the Education Ministry's head office, the latest high-rise to close in the city after a new seismic assessment. The chief executive of the Property Council, Leonie Freeman, says Matauranga House was remediated 7 years ago at a cost of millions of dollars and rated above 90% of the new building code. However, the latest seismic assessment puts it at just 25% because of its precast concrete flooring.
Most of the building owners are very aware of where their buildings are at. They just want to understand, okay, so what is that new standard? And that's what everybody's been asking for a number of years. We still don't have it.
And a new study has revealed that some animals may evolve faster than previously thought. The international study, which included researchers from the University of Auckland, examined the rates of evolution for 15 species. Many species are more adaptable than expected, but others, like the threatened New Zealand hihi, aren't so lucky. Co-author Dr. Anna Sanchia says climate change is especially threatening to animals like the hihi, which are slow to adapt.
They don't have a very good capacity to adapt to all of these changes that the environment's experiencing at the moment. Kind of on a good thing, and they're holding their population sizes where they are because of some really, really effective conservation management.
Dr. Sanchia says humans have an important role to play in protecting these species and preventing climate change from accelerating. That's the news.
This Sunday morning, racing car driver Scott McLaughlin on the eve of the Indy 500. A Yale professor's advice on how to influence people. A Kiwi journalist calls home from Toronto, but she'll also tell us what she saw in Ukraine. The music of Kenny G in a new documentary, and the songs of Bob Dylan in an acclaimed stage show arriving here. The age at which you stop listening to your mother, and the economic outlook for the world, all to be discussed from 8 o'clock this Sunday morning on RNZ National.
You're back on Checkpoint with Lisa Owen next. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Saturday. For Northland, Auckland and Coromandel Peninsula, fine spells and isolated showers. Showers are more extensive and heavier in Northland today. For Waikato, Waitomo, Taumarunui, Taupo and Bay of Plenty, fine. A possible shower tomorrow night about Western Bay of Plenty. For Taranaki and Taihape to Kapiti, fine apart from a few areas of cloud today. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa and Wellington, cloudy at times. A few light showers clearing from Wellington and Wairarapa this afternoon and elsewhere tomorrow. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Canterbury and Otago, fine apart from areas of valley fog tomorrow morning and early frosts. Westland and Fiordland, fine at first, but cloud increasing towards evening and a few showers are developing. For Southland, fine, a shower or two is possible about Stewart Island, and for the Chatham Islands, often cloudy with a few light showers until tomorrow morning. It's 6 minutes past 6. I'll update you with the latest news headlines at 6:30.
Kia ora e hoa. And just an update in breaking news further to our earlier story about the police manhunt underway in Auckland tonight after the brutal stabbing of a man in Mount Albert. The police say they have now issued a warrant to arrest 22-year-old Christian Tuati, and the warrant is on a charge of murder. Now, the police are warning people if they see Tuati, he is considered extremely dangerous and he should not be approached, and to call 111 immediately. They say a warrant to arrest for murder has been issued this evening. Welcome back. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Would-be parents using surrogates will no longer have to adopt their own child after it's born if the government accepts changes recommended by the Law Commission. Its review has found laws governing surrogacy are outdated and need a significant overhaul. At the moment, the person carrying the baby is the legal parent, regardless of whose genetic material is used. Lawyer Zandra Wakania has guided many New Zealand couples through the surrogacy process, and she joins me now. Kia ora. More than 60 recommendations. Do you think they've largely got it right with their conclusions?
Absolutely, yeah, delighted.
And specifically, what do you think would-be parents will be most pleased about? Is it this change or potential change to the fact that they will no longer have to legally adopt their child?
Yes, I think that's going to be that's going to be the best thing. That's going to be the greatest outcome, I think, for intending parents, is to not have to go through that process, which just feels crazy in the circumstances. Something that's going to be simpler, more efficient, more cost-effective, quicker. Just great for intending parents.
How onerous is the process right now, do you think?
It's a formal application for adoption that needs to be made. So, it's trying to make really an archaic law fit in the surrogacy arrangements, just never intended to do that. It's a formal application, takes, it's an expensive process, a long process, and it's not fit for purpose, just not fit.
Yeah, so in saying that, when we talk about potential law change, we're talking about changes to more than one law, right? So do you think that tinkering with those laws is the right solution?
Look, certainly my, the Law Society's recommendation, in my view, has always been that it would be better to have one standalone piece of legislation, easier for intended parties to just go to. Google Surrogacy New Zealand, get one piece of legislation, easy and more efficient. But looking at the reasoning, and I think it's going to be a more, I can understand the reasoning for just making those changes to those pieces of legislation, and hopefully it's going to be passed through quicker. It's going to be less onerous for Parliament, really, which is what we want, which is what we need. We need change.
So the Commission is not recommending full commercial surrogacy, but they do say there needs to be a bit more clarity around payment. How will that help? And what do you think surrogates should be able to, in essence, claim expenses for?
Yeah, look, to me, that's the great, that's such a great outcome. To me, that's the second biggest, greatest outcome of this, is that there's going to be some certainty and it's going to be set out exactly what reasonable surrogacy costs are. It means for the surrogate that they're not going to be out of pocket as they are at the moment. Being able to claim loss of income if they're not able to work for a while, to be able to claim expenses if they need assistance in looking after their children. All of those costs at the moment can't be paid for, and it certainly is going to it's going to increase, I think, the number of surrogate or number of people that are going to be prepared to be a surrogate. for some, the fact that if they're not able to work, and I've had an example like this where a surrogate has decided not to go through with a surrogacy arrangement because if there was a chance that she wasn't going to be able to work for a few months, not being able to be compensated for that, it meant not being able to provide for her family. In that case, it was a single mum. So, that arrangement couldn't go through. So that's significant.
So how often do these arrangements fall over? And can you give us an idea of how many surrogacy arrangements there might be in any given year?
Well, I think that's set out in the report. I think they said, was it about 50 or whatever a year? So we are seeing an increase every year. In terms of in the beginning, I've only had a few where they haven't gone ahead, and it's really, it's been in my example that that one example was around the surrogacy related costs, what could be claimed. That really is a great source of angst for the parties involved. This is now there's going to be some certainty around that, and everybody's going to know where they stand. And what's great is that of course, once there's an agreement, what's been recommended is that once there's an agreement reached between the parties about what exactly is going to be paid, it's going to be enforceable. The agreement itself is still not going to be enforceable, but costs are going to be able to be enforced, which is great. Great for the state.
Appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for joining us. That is Zandra Wakaneer, who's a lawyer who has, guided a number of New Zealand couples through surrogacy. And as she said, that report thinks that there's around 50 of the arrangements every year in New Zealand. Commercial property owners in Wellington are worried they may be stuck with office towers no one wants to rent or insure. There are now about 150 buildings in the CBD which share the same construction floor as the Education Ministry's head office. The order came this week to evacuate that building after a new seismic assessment. Ruth Hill reports.
Crisscrossed by fault lines and spread over reclaimed land and steep hillsides prone to slips, Wellington is a foolish place to build a city, let alone a capital. Yet building owners say the biggest risk they face is the lack of certainty about what they need to do to make their properties compliant. The Education Ministry's head office, Matauranga House, now emptied of 1,000 workers, underwent strengthening work in 2015. Property Council Chief Executive Leonie Freeman points out the building was considered 90 to 100% of new building standards.
So if you'd spent the millions and millions of dollars upgrading that building, and 7 years later you're told, well, no, it's not up to code, it's very unsettling. So the sector basically needs certainty around what are the rules and regulations, and then everybody can upgrade to those new standards.
The problem for Matauranga House is its hollow core precast concrete floors, which have a nasty habit of detaching during an earthquake, tearing walls apart and causing catastrophic collapse. Engineers have known about the problem since Massey University ran a series of tests in 2002, but they continued to be used, and there are now about 150 of them in Wellington alone. It was not until the 2016 Kaikohe earthquake that authorities took action. Leonie Freeman says legislation now out for consultation will prohibit precast concrete flooring in new buildings.
But the big question is, what about all the existing buildings? From the perspective of the building owners, the key thing that they need is, firstly, coordination of the guidelines and legislation, and the second thing is certainty.
When doing seismic assessments of potentially quake-prone buildings, engineers must use the 2017 Engineering Assessment Guidelines, known as the Red Book. A revised section, released in 2018, known as the Yellow Chapter, included new findings from the Kaikohe earthquake on concrete buildings. That's the version that's shown up the problems with Matauranga House, but it does not actually carry any legal weight. Wellington City Councillor Iona Pannett has the enviable job of chairing the Planning and Environment Committee.
Unfortunately, we don't have the legislative ability to do anything, but we can continue to educate owners about ways to make their buildings safer.
Insurance Council head Tim Grafton says clearly insurers are reluctant to accept risk for highly vulnerable buildings, as many Wellingtonians already know from the major premium hikes in the years following Kaikohe.
We were aware of issues such as the hollow core buildings, and we were criticised severely for our significant increase in premiums. All we do, we're the canary in the mine, and we signal risk. And now, a few years later, people are identifying hollow core buildings and something needs to be done about them. Well, we've already provided those signals.
Iona Pannett points out Wellington has about 600 potentially quake-prone buildings, and the city could not function if they were all shut down. She says following the Christchurch quake, the government introduced very strong legislation, but without putting in place provisions to pay for the work to be done.
Both Labour and national governments have, made a little bit of money available, but really, I think, just given this latest issue, there needs to be a full-scale review of the Act to see if it is actually fit for purpose, because the country can only go so far to pay to make every building safe.
All parties agree public safety comes first, but the questions remain. What are the biggest risks and who should pay to fix them?
The Brotherhood of New Zealand Photojournalists has answered the call of a terminally ill colleague to help out the cash-strapped Taranaki Hospice. Rob Tucker, a former illustrations editor at the New Zealand Herald, is putting together an auction of 100-plus iconic images to raise funds for the organisation he calls the Angels in the Night. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin has more.
Rob Tucker was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2019 and the disease has since spread into his bones. He says the hospice has been instrumental in him being able to continue to live at his New Plymouth home.
Some nights I'd be lying in bed and the pain would get to a stage where the morphine or the oxy pills I was taking didn't put a lid on the pain. And they'll come 24/7. You just give them a phone call and they would come in and give me an injection and sort of lay me out for the night and relieve my pain.
Tucker was horrified to find out the organisation needs to find $4 million to cover its operating costs.
I came up with this idea with all my mates who are photojournalists working on newspapers. Why don't we get a collection of historic photos that help mould the history of New Zealand, like the Buzzy Bee on the lawn with Prince William.
Tucker took that shot, which has been seen around the world but never before been put up for sale. Other single edition prints to be included in the auction include Michael Tubbety's image of Dame Whina Cooper walking hand in hand with a moko during the Māori Land March, and Jeff Dale's photo of Muhammad Ali sparring with a couple of likely lads on Queen Street in 1979. Award-winning Muriwai-based photographer Ross Land couldn't refuse Tucker's call.
Absolutely not. I mean, it's a fantastic idea. It's a great cause, and I feel sort of, very, very happy to be able to help Rob out. And it's also a way for me to give back to Taranaki Hospice a little bit too, because they looked after both my mum and dad and one of my brothers.
He credits Tucker with kick-starting his career by assigning him to the 1981 Springboks tour. But it's a shot of a fading athletic superstar his old boss has selected for the auction.
One of the ones that he quite likes and I'm very fond of as well is a shot of John Walker at the very end of his career at the 1990 Commonwealth Games in Auckland. He's sort of struggling up the straight to finish the race, and the two, both gold and silver medal Kenyan runners are shaking hands in the foreground with him struggling up the straight in the background. So that's one I particularly like, so I'm glad Rob's chosen that.
New Plymouth-based photographer and former Stuff staffer Andy Jackson is helping Tucker put together the catalogue. He's been blown away with what's been sent in.
I really love Fred Dagg sitting on the front of a Land Rover. That's one of my favourites. But oh God, they're all just incredible, and a lot of them people, they'll be familiar to people. So that's been really cool too. Finding out a little bit more about the backstory of some of these photos, which I never knew.
Meanwhile, Rob Tucker says the project has given him a new lease of life.
It's one that stops me looking around my garden to see where my funeral pot will be. And secondly, it's just lovely to be able to bring the brotherhood together and communicating, and because they haven't got together for years. So it's bringing this brotherhood of photographers together. And it's also hopefully going to raise some good funds for the hospice.
Taranaki Hospice says it's been overwhelmed with Tucker's generosity at a time when he's facing a life-limiting illness and complex decisions about his care. The Photojournalism New Zealand charity auction will be held at the Plymouth International Hotel in New Plymouth in September.
Tau kia, that is absolutely awesome, and you could check out Robin Martin's piece online. It's got some of the photos that they were talking about in it. It is 6:20. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Anger is mounting towards police in Texas over the way they dealt with a mass shooting at a primary school. Questions are being asked about why it took an hour for them to engage the 18-year-old gunman after he barricaded himself inside a classroom. Meanwhile, the husband of one of the 2 teachers killed in the massacre has died of a heart attack. His family blame grief. The BBC's Sarah Smith reports.
All of the 19 children and 2 teachers killed were in the same school class. Marie Jo Garza had just been given a phone for her 10th birthday. She used it to try and call the police. Jackie Carezes had just celebrated her first communion. She died alongside her cousin Annabel Guadalupe Rodriguez. Irma Garcia was one of the teachers killed. Today, her husband Joe died from a heart attack after visiting her memorial. They had 4 children. What were you thinking as you were there waiting in the classroom?
Am I gonna die?
You were worried that he might come in and start shooting children in your classroom?
But all I know is that he hurt my teacher and my friend.
10-year-old Jaden was in a nearby classroom where they could hear the gunshots, which killed several of his friends.
Ever since, my stomach's been hurting. It's been hurting to know that all these kids that died did not deserve any of this because we did nothing wrong.
Pictures show the scene outside the school on Tuesday. One man yells, "There's shooting." Distraught parents pleading with police officers, being told to stay back. Holding on to each other. Desperate to know what's happening inside. We're now learning more details about what was happening inside the school. The 2 teachers who were killed as they threw themselves in front of their students to try to save them from the gunman, and what the terrified children saw as he burst into their classroom. Questions are now being raised about how long it took for the police to go into the school and tackle the gunman. He was inside for 54 minutes before the police went in.
Officers are there, the initial officers, they receive gunfire. They don't make entry initially because of the gunfire they're receiving. But we have officers calling for additional resources. We need specialty equipment. We need body armor. We need precision riflemen.
The Duchess of Sussex made an unexpected appearance in Uvalde, laying a bunch of white roses in the town square. Right across America, students walked out of their schools in protest, demanding action to keep schools safe. In Uvalde, a small, grief-stricken town, 21 bereaved families are now starting to plan 21 funerals.
Almost a week after he lost office, it's been revealed that one of Scott Morrison's final acts as Australian Prime Minister was to publicise the arrival of an asylum seeker boat. The decision by the Border Force to confirm details of the sensitive operation on election day is now the subject of an inquiry ordered by the new Albanese government. The ABC's Andrew Green reports.
Just after midday on election day, Scott Morrison arrived in his southern Sydney electorate of Cook to an enthusiastic welcome. During a frantic Saturday morning of last-minute campaigning, reports had emerged of an asylum seeker boat interception in Australian waters. Just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Prime Minister addressed reporters and was asked about the on-water matter.
Well, I can confirm that there has been an interception of a vessel en route to Australia. That vessel has been intercepted in accordance with the policies of the government, and they're following those normal protocols.
Around the same time, a brief statement from the commander of Operation Sovereign Borders appeared on the Australian Border Force website. Rear Admiral Justin Jones confirming a vessel has been intercepted in a likely attempt to illegally enter Australia from Sri Lanka, while stressing that in line with long-standing practice, no further comment would be made. Now the ABC can reveal it was Scott Morrison's office that requested the Rear Admiral issue the unusual public public disclosure of a sensitive ABF operation before it had been completed. Officials with knowledge of Saturday's events say the Department of Home Affairs first examined the legality of issuing a statement during the election caretaker period and were concerned the Prime Minister's request could politicise the public service, but eventually approved it. On Wednesday, former Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews was asked by ABC News breakfast host Michael Rowland about her involvement.
You saw that statement before it went out, so did you press the button and say, yes, Border Force, you can release that statement?
Well, Border Force would have been releasing it in any event, making that statement. And I think it was important, given where we were, it was election day, that people did actually have a statement that made it very clear what was happening, but in a very operationally focused statement.
Shortly after confirmation of the boat arrival, the Liberal Party sent a mass of robo-text messages to voters, urging them to back the government and its tough border policies. The ABC has approached former Prime Minister Scott Morrison specifically to ask why his office had requested the Australian Border Force to reveal the boat interception, but he's declined to comment. The Department of Home Affairs says it would also be inappropriate to comment on the matter because the new Labor government has now ordered a review into the circumstances of the ABF statement.
And finally tonight, a tiny toy fox terrier from South Carolina now holds the record for the world's longest living pup. Pebbles, who loves pizza and cat food, is 22 years and 59 days old and weighs just 1.5 kilos. Reporter Lindsay Gibbs interviewed Pebbles and her owner Bob, who described her as a bit of a party animal.
Yeah, well, she likes to sleep all day. She's up all night. She is a wonderful companion. We got her 22 years ago, and she's been absolutely wonderful. She had a couple of litters in her time, and she likes all sorts of food. She likes pizza, believe it or not, but she really likes, she's on a cat food diet and this sort of thing. And so, she's just happy to be here.
Yeah, right. And going back to when you said you got her all of those years ago, you kind of mentioned that she chose you in a way. Tell us about that moment.
So, I was looking for a family pet at the time, and I wanted a bigger dog, actually a Rottweiler. And here was Pebbles in this little glass booth just jumping around, barking every time I went by her. And I tell people she actually picked me. So I took her out of the bus. I said, hey, let me see her. And it was like love at first sight. We just kind of, hit it off and brought her home.
Oh, I love that. And so tell us a little bit now. You said that she just loves to sunbathe all day and listen to country music. Well, who are her favorite artists?
Well, her favorite artists are Conway Twitty and Dwight Yoakam. She loves, she does sleep all day. So right now she's a little cranky from that, from being up right now. And she sleeps, and she's up all night.
Oh, wow. And so, for many of the dog owners out there, what is the secret into keeping your dogs alive this long?
I would say love.
Oh, and Pebbles looked like she was over that interview. 22 years old and 59 days. Wowza. A lot of you asking what age will you need to be to get the extra booster. Don't know yet. The Minister says several 100,000 people will be eligible. Residents of aged care facilities, and the final decisions on the makeup of the group will be made within the next 2 weeks, so we will keep you posted. That's all we've got time for. The Late News team's going to keep you updated throughout the night. And as always, if you missed anything or you want to re-listen to anything, you can find Checkpoint on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a fab weekend.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou. I'm Evie Ashton. Auckland police have launched a manhunt after the brutal fatal stabbing of a man in Mount Albert on Tuesday night. The leaders of the reclusive West Coast Christian sect Gloriavale have offered a public apology for failing to protect victims of labour exploitation and sexual abuse. A Law Commission report says surrogacy law is out of date and needs to be reformed. And